What happens when a simple request for help on a crowded airplane turns into a moment of shocking disrespect? On Flight 298 of Solara Air, a poised black woman quietly asks a flight attendant for assistance, and instead of kindness, she receives a shove. But this is no ordinary passenger. Beneath the unassuming facade hides Dr. Celeste Harmon, the very owner of the airline, flying undercover to witness firsthand the culture she vowed to change. Why did a senior flight attendant risk everything to lash out? What hidden forces allowed this toxic behavior to fester unchecked at 30,000 feet? And how far will one woman go to hold a system accountable? Not with anger, but with quiet, calculated resolve. This story is about more than a shove. It is about power, dignity, and the invisible barriers that persist in the skies and beyond. It is about what happens when courage meets injustice, and how one voice can spark a movement to redefine respect for every passenger and crew member. If you believe in justice and the power of human dignity, this is a story you cannot miss. Like, share, and subscribe now to follow the full journey and discover what happens when the overlooked become the unstoppable. The boarding gate at Atlanta Hartsfield buzzed with its usual airport energy. Rolling suitcases clicked against tile floors. Babies cried, and cell phone conversations filled the air in hushed tones of impatience and routine. Solara Air Flight 298 to Seattle was now boarding Group 4. Among the crowd stood a woman whose presence was anything but loud, yet quietly magnetic. Her name, at least for this flight, was Elise Monroe. She stepped forward, one hand wrapped lightly around the handle of a small gray roller bag, the other clutching a soft leather-bound book titled Letters from a Stoic. Her hair was tied back into a neat braid that hung over one shoulder. She wore no jewelry, no designer labels, only a simple ivory cardigan over a navy blue blouse and a pair of dark jeans. Her flats were worn, but clean. No makeup graced her face. Her only adornment was a faint calmness in her eyes, a look of observation rather than distraction. Elise walked onto the plane and located seat 24B economy, middle seat, toward the back half of the aircraft. As she sat down, she placed the book in her lap and gently slid her bag to the floor in front of her, tucking it as far under the seat as space would allow. The window seat remained empty. The aisle seat, 24A, was already occupied by a man who looked up and offered her a polite nod before returning to the crossword puzzle on his tablet. What no one on the flight knew, what no one could have guessed, was that Elise Monroe was not Elise at all. She was Dr. Celeste Harmon, CEO, engineer, strategist, billionaire. She was the silent owner of Solara Air, having acquired it just 7 months earlier through Harmon & Wells Equity, her private investment firm. The press had dubbed her the ghost investor because she rarely appeared in interviews, and even fewer people knew her face. That invisibility had become her greatest tool. Now, here she was, on her own plane, in coach, and no one had a clue. Celeste had been watching Solara's numbers closely since the acquisition. The former airline Crestline Airways had been bleeding customer trust for years, haunted by low satisfaction scores and a troubling pattern of passenger complaints. Celeste had rebranded the company, replaced outdated aircraft, and invested heavily in tech and route efficiency. But despite all that, the core issue remained. The human element. It wasn't the planes. It wasn't the software. It was the people. Her internal audits had flagged numerous service concerns, dismissive crew interactions, racially tinged complaints, and an entrenched culture of arrogance among some longtime staff. She'd read the reports. She'd reviewed the metrics. But today, she wanted to feel the truth. And that was why Elise Monroe existed. This wasn't Celeste's first ride in coach, but it was the first time she boarded her own airline as a mystery passenger. She chose a middle seat deliberately. She wanted the full picture: the crowding, the noise, the awkwardness of shared armrests. She wanted to see how the crew treated those who had no power. The last group of passengers began boarding. A crying toddler clung to her mother's leg in the aisle. A young man with a guitar case bumped into multiple seats. Celeste kept her eyes open, observing small things: a raised eyebrow, a forced smile, a gesture of impatience. The aisle buzzed with noise and apology. Overhead bins clicked open and shut. She heard the sharp voice of a flight attendant several rows ahead. "Ma'am, if your bag doesn't fit, it needs to be checked. That's not up for discussion." Celeste turned subtly in her seat and caught a glimpse of the woman who had spoken. Blonde hair twisted tightly into a bun, expression sharp, posture rigid. Her voice carried not warmth, but warning. That must be Kendra Mays, Celeste thought. She recognized the name from audit reports. The woman in question moved down the aisle like a patrol officer rather than a hostess. She made a show of slamming an overhead bin shut and barked, "Let's keep the aisles clear, folks. We're trying to board on time." Celeste noted the tension in the cabin. It wasn't typical pre-departure stress. It was pressure emanating from one person, polluting the air like invisible smoke. The energy shifted whenever Kendra passed. Her seatmate in 24A, a man in his early 50s with salt and pepper hair, leaned over and whispered, "Every flight lately feels like being yelled at by the principal." Celeste smiled softly. "You fly often, twice a month," he replied. "West Coast projects. I'm Victor, by the way." "Elise," she answered, still playing the role. Their conversation was interrupted as the final boarding call echoed through the speakers. A few stragglers hurried aboard. A teenage boy with headphones took the window seat beside her and offered a sheepish smile. She returned it kindly. Celeste glanced up at the overhead bin. The one above her seat was already jammed with backpacks and oversized coats. Her roller bag sat awkwardly at her feet. It barely fit under the seat, and she knew it wouldn't pass inspection. She scanned the cabin. The bin directly across the aisle had space. It wasn't far, but it would require stepping over Victor, and awkwardly turning into the aisle. A small act, easily done, but she wanted to test the service. This was what a regular passenger would do: ask for help. She pressed the call button above her seat. A soft chime echoed. The tiny light glowed above her. She waited. A few seconds passed before she saw Kendra's sharp eyes flick toward the light. Her mouth twitched in annoyance. Then she began walking back slowly, every step deliberate. Celeste tucked her book in the seat pocket. She took a slow breath. This was not Elise Monroe preparing to ask for help. This was Dr. Celeste Harmon preparing to look into the soul of her company. And she had no idea just how much that soul was about to be tested. Kendra Mays approached with the kind of exaggerated calm that made people nervous. Her polished black heels struck the floor with sharp taps, as if the carpet were an inconvenience. As she reached row 24, her eyes fixed on the glowing call light above Elise Monroe's seat. She did not smile. She did not greet. She simply said yes. The word dropped flat between them. It was less a question and more a challenge. Elise lifted her gaze, her voice steady but kind. "Excuse me, I noticed the overhead bin above me is full. There's an open space just across the aisle. I was wondering if you could help me place my bag there. I didn't want to hold anyone up by climbing over my seatmate." She gestured to Victor beside her, who was currently leaning slightly away, politely giving her space. Kendra's eyes flicked to the small roller bag at her feet, then to the bin across the aisle, then back to Elise. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Passengers are responsible for their own luggage," she replied coolly. "We're preparing for departure. That bag should have been stowed when you boarded." There was no suggestion of assistance, no empathy, only reprimand. Elise remained calm, but inside, something clenched. Not rage, not even frustration, just the quiet confirmation of what she already suspected. "I understand that," she said evenly. "I boarded early. The bin was already full. My seatmates arrived after me, so I didn't want to climb over them while the aisle was crowded. I just thought Kendra cut her off. It's a small bag. You can manage. This isn't a moving service. Turn off the call light, please." She reached up and pressed the button with a jab of her manicured finger. The light clicked off, and then she walked away. Victor glanced over. "That was unnecessary," he said quietly. Elise forced a small smile. "It's all right. But it wasn't. Not really." She glanced down at her book in the seat pocket. The pages had been worn by fingers far more patient than hers. She remembered reading once, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy. Stoicism in action, not just in silence, but in clarity, in discipline." Still, something deep within her stirred. This wasn't just rudeness. It was the posture of someone who had grown too comfortable with power and forgotten the purpose it was meant to serve. Kendra hadn't just dismissed her. She had broadcast to the entire row that this passenger was not worth her time. Elise considered getting up anyway, asking Victor to move so she could do it herself. She even shifted slightly in her seat. But before she could, a new voice floated over the seat backs. "Hey there, just checking if anyone still needs help up here." It came from a different flight attendant, younger, softer voice, Latino, maybe mid-20s. His name tag read Jonah. He was working the opposite side of the cabin, but his eyes were scanning her row with sincere curiosity. Elise raised her hand slightly. "Actually, yes. I have a bag I need to place in that bin. It's right behind your row. Would you mind giving me a hand?" "Absolutely," he said, moving forward without hesitation. "Mind if I step over?" Victor stood immediately. "We'll get out of your way." Jonah gave a quick nod of thanks, reached across the aisle, and in one smooth motion, lifted Elise's roller bag and slid it into the empty space. "No fuss, no drama, just help. All done. You're good to go. Need anything else?" "No, thank you. That was very kind." Jonah smiled. "No problem. Let me know if you need anything later." As he walked away, Elise turned back to her seat and caught Kendra watching from a few rows ahead, her expression unreadable. Then she turned sharply and disappeared toward the galley. Elise sat back and breathed in slowly. She didn't want this to be a thing. She hadn't asked for special treatment. She had asked for basic decency. She turned to Victor. "That young man is a credit to this airline." Victor nodded. "Jonah. I've seen him before. Always polite. That other one." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The safety demonstration began to play on the overhead monitors. Bright digital avatars smiled and mimed seatbelt buckles. A woman in animated form gestured to the emergency exits, her voice cheerful and empty of weight. The real cabin, in contrast, felt subdued. As the plane pushed back from the gate, Elise allowed herself to fade into quiet. She tilted her head back and closed her eyes, but rest didn't come. She thought about her mother, a stewardess in the 70s, back when it was all about hair and heels and weighing under a certain number of pounds. Her mother had lasted 3 years before quitting, not because the job was hard, because the people were cruel. Elise remembered hearing stories growing up about passengers who wouldn't look her mother in the eye, about supervisors who criticized her smile, but not her white colleagues, about how she was once demoted for attitude after politely asking a man not to touch her arm. And now here she was, all these years later, the owner of the airline her mother would never have been allowed to manage. The irony tasted bitter. The seatbelt sign blinked off. The plane leveled at cruising altitude. A cart clinked from the rear. Beverage service had begun. Jonah appeared on the far side, working his way up the aisle. He smiled as he passed each row, taking requests, pouring ginger ale and tomato juice, laughing softly when a child asked for an extra cookie. And then Kendra appeared. She came up Elise's side. All business, no smile. She served the row behind them, then the row ahead. When she reached 24A and Victor asked for coffee, she poured it quickly and passed him a creamer. Then she looked past Elise and pushed the cart forward. Elise blinked. "Excuse me," Victor said aloud, frowning. "You skipped her." Kendra stopped, turned. "Oh, sorry. Didn't see you." She backtracked 2 steps and gave Elise a look that was neither apology nor acknowledgement. "What do you want?" Elise kept her voice neutral. "Just a black coffee." "Thank you." Kendra poured the liquid, sloshing it slightly, and handed it over without a word. Their fingers brushed. Kendra recoiled almost imperceptibly. Victor leaned over as she passed. "She definitely saw you." Elise nodded. She knew. Jonah passed again a few minutes later and checked in with a mother 2 rows ahead who was trying to calm her baby. He offered her water. He crouched slightly so he was eye level with the child and made a silly face. The baby stopped crying. Elise watched, memorized. The contrast was unbearable. She pulled out her notebook. Small, black, unbranded. She began writing. This was not a diary. This was a report. She started a list. Underlined names. Observed behavior. She included herself, too, noting how she felt, when she wavered, when she hesitated to speak up. She wanted to be thorough. She wasn't angry, not in the usual sense. She felt something colder, more precise. If Kendra believed she had won a power struggle over a passenger, she had badly misjudged the playing field. Elise looked out the window. Clouds drifted like slow thoughts across the darkening sky. It would be a 5-hour flight to Seattle, and there was still so much more to see, somewhere over Missouri. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft amber glow. The scent of coffee still lingered faintly in the air, mingled with the mechanical hush of engines and the occasional crinkle of snack wrappers. Passengers settled into their own little cocoons of distraction books, screens, pillows tucked against the window. Elise Monroe remained perfectly still in seat 24B. The notebook she had been writing in was now tucked discreetly into her side bag. Her fingers rested lightly on the cover of her book, but her thoughts had drifted far from the page. She was watching again, listening, measuring the temperature of the human landscape inside this flying metal capsule. It wasn't just Kendra's behavior that troubled her. It was the silence that surrounded it. The way her dismissiveness seemed normalized, even expected. The way Dana, the purser, hadn't once passed through to offer presence or balance. The way certain passengers had started to shrink into their seats when Kendra walked by. Elise had always believed that culture did not reside in slogans or training manuals. It lived in tone, in glance, in the invisible signals passed between people. And on Solara Flight 298, the culture was broken. She stretched slightly, adjusting her legs, feeling the subtle ache of having sat for too long. Her bag now rested safely across the aisle in the bin Jonah had helped her reach. She had debated retrieving something from it, a neck pillow, maybe, or a pen, but the thought of navigating the narrow aisle while Kendra stalked nearby was unappealing. Still, the pressure in her lower back was becoming uncomfortable. She decided to stand briefly and stretch. "Excuse me," she said gently to Victor. "Of course," he replied, already beginning to shift his legs to let her pass. She stood carefully, leaning slightly forward so she wouldn't bump the tray tables. As she stepped into the aisle, her eyes flicked toward the rear galley where Kendra was conversing with Dana. Their posture was relaxed, but Elise could feel the quick glance Kendra threw her way. The energy changed. She turned to retrieve her bag, or maybe just walk a few steps and ease the stiffness in her spine, when Kendra appeared suddenly. "You need to sit down now. We're preparing for turbulence." Her tone was curt, her body language invasive. She stepped closer than necessary, positioning herself in Elise's space. "I'll just be a second," Elise said calmly. "I'm standing to stretch, and then I'll return to my seat." "No. Now, sit down." Elise held her ground. "I understand the rules. I'm not trying to disobey them, but I've been seated for several hours, and I need to move for a moment." Kendra's eyes narrowed. Her lips twitched. For a brief moment, Elise saw it. The desire not to enforce a rule, but to win, to assert dominance, to remind this passenger, this black woman, that she wasn't in control here. Then Kendra stepped forward and did something Elise would never forget. She placed her hand on Elise's shoulder and shoved. It wasn't a guiding hand. It wasn't a light touch. It was a push. Firm, deliberate, meant to displace her, to humiliate. Elise stumbled backward, bumping hard against the armrest of Victor's seat. Her book fell from her hand, hitting the floor with a muted thump and sliding under the seat in front of her. Gas rippled through the cabin. Victor sprang to his feet. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he said. Eyes flashing, passengers turned, eyes wide, mouths parted in disbelief. The quiet murmur of the cabin was gone, replaced by that awful tension that follows the unexpected. When people try to determine if what they saw was real, Kendra stepped back, her hand still raised slightly as if surprised at her own action. This passenger refused to sit down. She announced loudly she was interfering with cabin safety. "That is not true," Victor said firmly. "She just stood to stretch. You shoved her. Everyone saw it." Kendra turned toward the front of the plane, her voice sharp. "Dana, I need you back here. Within seconds." Dana appeared from the front galley. Her eyes landed first on Kendra, then on Elise, who had straightened slowly and was now holding her hands at her sides. "What's going on?" Dana demanded. Kendra spoke first, breathless and theatrical. She was out of her seat during final prep. "I asked her to sit. She became agitated. I thought she might lose balance, so I tried to guide her back down. She refused. She's being disruptive." "That's a lie," Victor snapped. "That is absolutely not what happened." Dana turned toward Elise, sizing her up. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to remain calm. If this continues, we will need to inform airport authorities. Do you understand me?" It was the tone more than the words. Condescending, final, threatening. A silence fell again. Elise looked at both women, Kendra's face still flushed with anger, Dana's wearing the smug assurance of someone defending her crew without question, not because it was right, but because it was routine. Elise inhaled slowly. I understand you perfectly." Her voice was ice. She bent down, retrieved her book from the floor, dusted off the corner, and returned to her seat without another word. Victor remained standing for a second longer, looking between the two attendants with disbelief. Then he sat, muttering something under his breath. A few rows behind them, someone whispered. Someone else shook their head. Jonah appeared at the edge of the aisle, his face pale. He had missed the moment, but the aftermath was unmistakable. Elise opened her book again. She did not read. Her hands trembled slightly. From across the aisle, she heard Kendra scoff and whisper something to Dania. "Some people are just looking for drama." She was probably hoping to get a voucher or sue the airline or something. Dana murmured her agreement. Elise closed her eyes. Not because she was tired, because she was collecting herself, because she was resisting the very human urge to erupt. That would be their story if she did. The angry passenger, the aggressive woman, another problem needing control. But that wasn't her story. Not today. Not ever. The cabin remained quiet long after the confrontation. That kind of silence was not calm. It was stiff, uneasy, the kind that settled in when people didn't know whether to look, speak, or pretend they hadn't seen what just happened. Elise Monroe sat perfectly still. Her hands were clasped together on her lap. Her book, which moments earlier had fallen from her grasp, remained unopened beside her. The seat back in front of her was inches from her face, yet her gaze stayed fixed on something much farther away, something that only she could see. She was thinking, not reacting, not replaying the scene like a victim. She was building, because that was what Celeste Harmon did. She built systems, bridges, power structures that could not be shaken by weather or arrogance. She had sat in meetings with heads of state and Fortune 50 CEOs. She had faced rooms of men who doubted her and turned them into allies. She had risen through every barrier that had once tried to cage her. But this moment stung deeper than she expected, not because of the shove, but because of what it represented. Victor glanced over, whispering softly, "I saw the whole thing, every second of it. If they try to twist the story, I'll speak up. I promise." She nodded, giving him a quiet look of appreciation, but she said nothing. Behind her, a woman whispered to her husband, "I've never seen anything like that before." And she was so calm. She didn't raise her voice. She just stood there. Her husband replied in a hush. That flight attendant was way out of line. Elise heard it all, every word, but she also heard something else, the voice inside her own mind, the part of her that had warned her not to do this flight in the first place. That had said, "This is a bad idea. You're not ready to be anonymous again." But that was the point. She didn't want comfort. She wanted clarity. And now she had it. Jonah passed by again slowly, pushing the empty beverage cart back toward the galley. His face looked conflicted, troubled. When he reached her row, he paused. "Ma'am," he said softly, "are you okay?" Elise looked up at him. Her voice was calm, but there was steel beneath the surface. "Thank you for asking. I'll be all right." Jonah nodded, then added in a voice so low only she could hear, "I'm really sorry about what happened. That should not have gone down like that." She didn't answer right away. Then, softly, "Do you like working here?" "Jonah?" He blinked. I like flying. I like helping people. I love the actual job." But he trailed off. But she prompted gently, "There's a culture thing. Some of the senior staff, They run things like it's still the 90s, and people like me, I just keep my head down." She nodded. "Thank you. That's all I needed to hear." He looked at her again, longer this time, as if sensing something just beneath the surface that he couldn't quite name. Then he turned and pushed the cart away. Elise leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes. The plane flew through a pocket of mild turbulence, just enough to make the overhead lights flicker and rattle a few overhead bins. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're expecting a bit of choppy air over the Rockies. Nothing serious, but please remain seated with your belts fastened. We'll be landing in Seattle in just under 2 hours. Thank you." The voice was warm, polished, but far away. Elise opened her eyes again and stared at the call button above her seat. Not in anger, in reflection. She thought about her mother again. How many times had she asked for help on a plane and been ignored? How many quiet shoves had she endured over the years? Disguised as policy or protocol or pretense, Elise had inherited more than her mother's skin and smile. She had inherited her silence, her resilience, but not her acceptance. No, Elise had the power to reshape the air around her. Victor cleared his throat beside her. "Do you mind if I ask you something? Of course you're not just a regular passenger, are you?" She turned her head slowly. "What makes you say that he smiled?" But it was thoughtful. "You have a way of holding still that feels like it's on purpose, like you're letting people show you who they are. And when that flight attendant shoved you, you didn't react like someone who was surprised. You reacted like someone who was disappointed." Elise didn't speak for a moment. Then she asked, "What do you do for a living?" "Victor Consulting. People. Culture. I read systems. I'm good at patterns. So you're trained to see beneath the surface." "Something like that." She looked at him and offered a quiet smile. "Maybe one day I'll tell you who I am. But not yet." "Fair enough," he said, and leaned back again. His tone remained gentle, respectful. As the cabin dimmed even more and the hum of the engine softened into white noise, a strange sense of calm settled into Elise's body. Not peace, not forgiveness, clarity. She reached into her bag and pulled out the notebook again. She began to write. This time, her pen moved faster, with purpose. She documented names, actions, timestamps, but she also wrote something more. Intentions. She created a new page, title, Intervention Plan. Phase 1. Her handwriting was neat, angular, exact. She wrote not just about this flight, but about the next 20, about how to embed ethics into behavior, about how to measure respect without relying on complaints, about how to protect good employees like Jonah from bad leadership. Elise wasn't just taking notes anymore. She was designing a reckoning. In the rows ahead, Kendra and Dana were laughing softly. They had returned to the front galley, no doubt assuming the moment had passed, the humiliation buried. They did not know what they had done. They did not know who they had touched. They did not know that somewhere behind them sat the mind that would dismantle everything they believed they could get away with. Elise closed the notebook. She tucked it carefully away. She turned to the window and looked out at the vastness below. City lights flickered in the distance like tiny stars resting on the earth. Soon, Seattle would appear on the horizon, and so would the truth. The glow from the overhead lights had dimmed into a dusky blue, casting soft shadows over the cabin of Flight 298. Most of the passengers had settled into a quiet rhythm of distraction. Headphones cocooned them in music or movies. A few read under the individual reading lights. Others simply stared into nothing, letting the hum of the engines drown out their thoughts. Elise Monroe sat with her head tilted gently toward the window, watching as the last traces of daylight faded into a deep violet. The mountains below blurred in soft ridges under the clouds. 2 hours ago, she had been just another face in the back of a plane. Now, she was a loaded spring. She kept her body still, but her mind moved in firm, deliberate steps. Every second of the confrontation replayed in her mind, not in anger, but in calculation. She was no longer reacting. She was structuring. At the front of the cabin, Kendra May stood pouring water into paper cups. Her voice hushed as she chatted with Dana. Their movements were casual, almost playful. Occasionally, they glanced toward the back of the plane, but never for long. They believed the moment had passed, that the small act of power had been buried under silence. They didn't know the truth had already taken root in the notebook of the woman in 24B. Elise opened her journal again, not because she needed to, but because the motion itself helped her think clearly. Each page now held something different, not just bullet points, but directives, policies, questions for HR audits, plans for a full ethics overhaul of the flight experience team. She turned to a fresh page and wrote a single word across the top: confrontation. She underlined it once, then twice. She knew something was coming. Not in months, not in weeks. Tonight. This would not end at baggage claim. The overhead speakers crackled softly, and the captain's voice returned. Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our initial descent into Seattle. Weather's cool and clear on the ground. We'll be landing in approximately 25 minutes. Please return to your seats and ensure your belts are fastened. A shuffle of motion passed through the cabin. Trays folded up, blankets were brushed off laps. Some passengers woke gently, confused by the shift in altitude. Elise remained motionless. Her hands gripped the journal lightly. She glanced across the aisle to where her roller bag sat safely in the overhead compartment. It felt almost symbolic now. The thing she had asked help for. The catalyst. She exhaled slowly. Victor leaned toward her slightly. If you don't mind me asking, what happens when we land? She glanced at him. Why do you ask? Because something tells me you're not walking off that plane like this never happened. She considered his words, then spoke softly. When someone mistreats you, you have a choice. You can shout back, you can shrink, or you can redesign the walls they built around themselves. Make them transparent. Make them accountable. So which one are you choosing? All three, but in the order that stings the most. Victor gave a small smile. Then I pity whoever's waiting on the other side of that terminal. She didn't return the smile. Not yet. Not until the work was done. Kendra began her final pass through the cabin, checking belts and tray tables. Her face was professional now, neutral, but her eyes flicked briefly toward Elise and then away. Not fear, not guilt, just that slight flinch of someone who knows they may have pushed too far and is pretending they didn't. Dana followed behind, murmuring a few thanks and smiling politely to families with children. She said nothing to Elise. Neither of them did. It was cowardice masked as procedure. Jonah was the last to walk by. He moved slower. He made eye contact, and this time, when he passed Elise's row, he reached down discreetly and slid a folded napkin into the crease of her journal. She waited until he passed before opening it. On the napkin, scribbled in slightly shaky handwriting, were 2 lines. I saw it. I'm willing to speak. I'm sorry I didn't step in faster. She folded the napkin once and tucked it into the back pocket of her notebook. Her grip on the pages tightened. 10 minutes later, The wheels of Flight 298 touched down in Seattle with a soft bounce and a short rush of brakes. The passengers clapped lightly. A few chuckled. The familiar ritual of landing safety brought with it the sense of relief that always came when a flight reached the ground without incident. But there had been an incident, and it was not over. As the plane taxied toward Gate 12, Dana's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off. For those with connecting flights, you'll find updated gate information on the monitors inside the terminal. Thank you for flying with Solara Air." The light above dimmed. The plane slowed to a full stop. Seatbelt clicks echoed down the rows. Elise did not move. She waited. Passengers began to stand, reaching for bags, stretching arms. Children giggled. A businessman tapped impatiently at his phone. Victor turned to her again. "You sure about this?" She looked at him, calm, centered. "I've never been more certain of anything." The seatbelt light went off with a soft chime. Then Elise stood, slowly and deliberately. She reached across the aisle and retrieved her bag without assistance. As she turned to face the front of the plane, she saw Dana speaking softly to Kendra near the galley curtain. Dana's gaze met hers. Something in her eyes shifted, a flicker of recognition, like a puzzle piece falling into place too late. Elise moved forward, her bag rolling quietly behind her. She did not rush. With every step down the aisle, more heads turned, not because of what she wore, not because of what she said, but because of the weight of her silence, the way her posture seemed heavier than it should have been, as if the air itself parted slightly around her. As she reached the front galley, Dana stepped forward. "Ma'am, if there was any misunderstanding earlier, I'd be happy to file a feedback note for you." Elise looked at her. There was no misunderstanding. Kendra opened her mouth to speak, but Elise raised a single finger. "Do not." The tone was quiet, final. Then Elise reached into her bag and pulled out a black business card. She placed it in Dana's palm and closed the woman's fingers around it. The two attendants looked down. There was no name on the front, only a golden monogram. C.H. Dana flipped it over. CEO, Harmon & Wells Equity. Executive Board. Solara Air. The color drained from her face. Kendra stepped back like she'd been struck. Elise leaned in slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "There will be a conversation, but not with you." She turned without another word and walked off the plane into the quiet, gleaming jet bridge. Jonah stood by the door, eyes wide. She paused only for a second and gave him a subtle nod of thanks. Then she disappeared into the terminal. But the echo of her presence remained behind, and the real storm was only just beginning. The sliding glass doors of Seattle-Tacoma International opened with a soft whoosh, letting in the crisp night air and the distant sound of rolling luggage. Elise walked through calmly, her pace unhurried. Her small suitcase moved silently behind her across the polished floor. The airport buzzed around her, but it didn't touch her. She walked in a silence of her own design. Outside, a black town car idled near the curb. The driver, a tall man in his early 40s wearing a navy pea coat, stepped forward the moment he saw her. He opened the back door without a word, nodding with quiet respect. "Good evening, Ms. Harmon. Evening, Marcus. Thank you for being prompt." Always she slid into the back seat. As the door closed, the sounds of the terminal fell away. Marcus returned to the driver's seat and pulled into the slow stream of cars. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the turn signals, the faint hum of tires on wet pavement, and the click of Elise's pen as she opened her notebook once more. "How did it go?" Marcus asked finally, glancing into the rearview mirror. "Exactly as expected. You were pushed." "Yes." Marcus's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. "Want me to make the call tonight?" "No, not yet. I want the paperwork waiting on their desks first. I want this to be clinical, not emotional." "Understood." Elise looked out the window. The city lights shimmered in the distance, reflected in rain-speckled glass. Seattle's skyline sat quiet, unaware of the storm rolling toward it from 30,000 feet. "I want full transcripts pulled from the cabin crew radios," she continued, "and I want the CCTV footage from the gate lobby before boarding. Passenger boarding scans, too. Build me a timeline. Consider it done. Jonah Ruiz. He's the junior flight attendant who helped you. Should I flag him? No. Protect him. Quietly. If his record's clean, fast-track him through the ethics leadership track we've been developing, and the others Elise didn't answer right away. Let them sit in their comfort for one more night." Marcus nodded again, and silence fell once more. By the time they reached the Harmon and Wells private headquarters in the heart of downtown, it was nearly 1 drowsme mem. The building was dark from the outside, but inside the executive floor, lights flicked on automatically as they walked through the glass doors. Elise went directly to the operations conference room. It was already prepared. On the center of the table sat a slim file folder marked Solara 298, Immediate Action Plan. A team of 3 executives, Rachel Lowe, Senior Compliance Counsel, Andre Mathers, Head of People Strategy, and Noor Malik. Director of Internal Affairs stood waiting, each holding a tablet. Elise took her seat at the head of the table. "Begin." Rachel spoke first. "We've reviewed the entire staff profile on Kendra Mays. 21-year tenure. Reprimanded 3 times for verbal altercations with passengers. All settled quietly before acquisition. Dana Whitmore has 6 years with Solara. Spotless file on the surface, but audit flags from 2 international crews suggest she suppresses subordinate complaints, and the junior staffer, Jonah clean record. High passenger satisfaction surveys. Noted twice in peer reviews for calming tense situations with grace." "What about the purser rotation logic?" Elise asked. "How did Dana end up lead on that flight?" Andre answered. "The algorithm flagged her due to seniority and familiarity with that route. She's been coasting under the radar." Elise nodded once, sharp and focused. Noor leaned forward slightly. "We also confirm what you predicted." Post-incident chatter from crew to ground was dismissive. They assumed the passenger involved would file a standard complaint. "They're not prepared for what's coming," Good Elise said. "Let them stay unprepared." She tapped her fingers gently on the armrests of the leather chair. "Tomorrow morning, I want the following steps initiated. 1. Place both Kendra and Dana on immediate suspension, pending investigation. Notify them at 9:00 a.m. Pacific Time. Do not let them work another route. 2. Launch the new ethics line early. Offer anonymity. Attach bonus incentives for first wave reports. Start with flight crew only 3. Prepare a board memorandum and CC external counsel. Title it, Passenger Rights Violation, Executive Intervention. Rachel scribbled quickly on her notepad, already anticipating the next steps. Elise stood, and finally, schedule a media blackout for 72 hours. No press, no leaks. I'll control the message when I decide how this story ends. The team nodded. "Anything else?" Marcus asked from the doorway. "Yes," Elise said. "Tomorrow night. We fly again. You're going back on board. Not as Elise Monroe, as Dr. Celeste Harmon, first class. I want the world to know exactly who I am. and why this airline's future will never again look like its past. The room stayed silent. It was the kind of silence that filled spaces when everyone present knew something historic had just begun. Elise walked out of the room and into the hallway toward her office. Framed on the wall was a photo of her late mother, Alma Harmon, standing beside a vintage aircraft in 1965. She had never been allowed to fly it, despite being qualified, too loud, too black, too female. Her mother had always said, "You don't fight power, you redesign it." And that was what Elise was doing. She sat alone at her desk with only her notebook, a glass of cold water, and her thoughts. She turned to a fresh page and wrote at the top in large letters, "Day 1, rebuild the skies." She let the words sit there for a long moment. Then she began to write again, line by line, constructing a policy framework rooted not in fear, but in dignity. A new onboarding manual, a code of conduct that rewarded empathy, not obedience, a culture that defended passengers, not protocol. By dawn, it would be complete. And by the time Flight 298 made its return trip the following day, nothing about Solara Air would feel safe for those who had grown too comfortable hurting people from behind their uniforms. They had shoved the wrong woman, and now the sky itself was shifting. The morning sun filtered through the tall glass windows of the Solara Air corporate headquarters, casting long shafts of light across the sleek, minimalist lobby. The building, once a dull shell from a previous era, now gleamed with the promise of change. Yet beneath the polished surfaces, a tension rippled through the air. Inside the executive conference room, the mood was charged but controlled. At the center of the long table sat Dr. Celeste Harmon, her posture upright, her gaze steady. Around her, the senior leadership team awaited her directions, their faces a mix of anticipation and unease. Celeste spoke clearly, her voice calm but imbued with authority. Today marks a turning point for Solara Air. The incident on Flight 298 has exposed a deeper problem, one that goes beyond individual actions and touches the very culture of this company. We cannot afford to sweep this under the rug. Our response must be swift, transparent, and uncompromising. Rachel Lowe nodded, fingers poised over her tablet. Our legal team has prepared the initial suspension notices for Kendra Mays and Dana Whitmore. We are ready to deliver them as soon as you give the word. Andre Mathers chimed in. We have also finalized the rollout plan for the Passenger Dignity Program. It focuses on empathy training, real-time feedback systems, and accountability measures. It will require buy-in from every level of the organization. Noor Malik added, the ethics hotline is set up and ready to launch today. We've included anonymous reporting options to protect employees who come forward. Celeste listened, absorbing the details, her mind already racing ahead. Good. But we need to anticipate the backlash. The unions will push back hard. The media will spin the story in ways we can't control. We must own the narrative before others do. She paused, locking eyes with each executive. Prepare a comprehensive communications plan. Coordinate with PR. I want honest messaging that acknowledges the problem but focuses on our commitment to change. No sugarcoating, no deflection. Rachel nodded. Understood. Celeste continued. I also want to personally meet with Jonah Ruiz today. His professionalism during Flight 298 stood out. We need to empower people like him. He represents the future. Andre smiled. I'll arrange that meeting. As the session concluded, Celeste stepped into the hallway and took a deep breath. The weight of leadership pressed on her, but she welcomed it. Change was never easy. It was messy. It demanded courage and conviction. She thought about Kendra and Dana. Two women who had worn their uniforms like armor, believing their power unassailable. They had mistaken authority for entitlement and forgotten the humanity beneath. She remembered her mother, Alma Harmon, who had faced prejudice not just from strangers, but from the very system designed to elevate. Alma's stories echoed in her mind, fueling her resolve. Later that afternoon, Celeste met Jonah in a quiet conference room bathed in natural light. The young flight attendant entered with a mixture of nervousness and hope. "Jonah," she began warmly, "I want to thank you for the way you handled yourself on Flight 298. It's not easy to stand out when the culture pushes you to blend in." He smiled shyly. "Thank you, ma'am. I just tried to do my job." Celeste nodded. "That's exactly the point. Doing your job should never mean ignoring injustice or allowing mistreatment to continue unchecked. I want you to be part of a new initiative we're launching, one that puts dignity and respect at the heart of our service." Jonah's eyes brightened. "I'd be honored." Meanwhile, word of the suspensions had begun to ripple through the company. Kendra and Dana found themselves summoned to a stark meeting room, their faces pale with shock. The suspension letters lay on the table. The language was unambiguous, effective immediately. Both were relieved of their duties pending a full investigation into the incident on Flight 298 and related allegations. Kendra's hands trembled as she read. "This is a mistake," she whispered. "I was just doing my job." Dana's voice was more composed, but edged with desperation. "We've been loyal to this airline for decades. This isn't how things are done." But the reality was undeniable. The system had changed. The old protections no longer applied. Outside, whispers filled the halls. Some employees expressed support for the leadership's decisive action, while others grumbled about loyalty and the good old days. Celeste knew the road ahead would be rocky. Resistance was inevitable. But so was transformation. That evening, as the city lights twinkled outside her office window, Celeste opened her notebook and wrote the words that had come to define this journey. Change begins with courage. She closed the book, the resolve in her heart steady as ever. The hum of the office was quiet but persistent. Late into the evening, Dr. Celeste Harmon sat alone in her private office overlooking the cityscape of Seattle. The glow of the skyline stretched far and wide, but inside, the atmosphere was charged with reflection and purpose. Her fingers rested lightly on a worn photograph of her mother, Alma Harmon, dressed in the vibrant uniform of a flight attendant from decades ago. The weight of history settled over her like a heavy cloak. Celeste recalled the stories Alma told her, the invisible walls she faced, the subtle and overt biases woven into every interaction, the way service was both a performance and a battleground. Alma had left the skies early, crushed not by the physical demands, but by the culture that refused to see her as equal. Tonight, Celeste promised herself, the cycle would end. Her phone buzzed softly. A message from Jonah Ruiz appeared. "I'm ready to help however I can." She smiled, grateful for allies. The following morning, the Solaire Air headquarters buzzed with an energy that balanced tension and cautious optimism. Employees gathered in break rooms, whispering about the sweeping changes initiated by the CEO's swift action. In the cabin of Flight 299 preparing for departure to Los Angeles, a new crew was assembling. Jonah Ruiz adjusted his uniform, feeling the weight of new responsibilities but buoyed by a growing sense of purpose. He had been asked to lead a pilot program aimed at transforming in-flight service culture. It was an opportunity he accepted with humility and determination. Meanwhile, Kendra Mays sat at home, the reality of suspension sinking in. The unrelenting storm of social media criticism had turned her into a pariah overnight. Messages flooded her inbox, some sympathetic, many condemning. The facade she had maintained was cracking. Dana Whitmore faced similar isolation. Longtime colleagues avoided her calls. The airline community, once tightly knit, had fractured. At Solaire Air's headquarters, Celeste convened a meeting with the training department. She laid out a vision of a passenger dignity charter, a comprehensive plan to redefine how crew members interacted with every passenger regardless of background. Training would no longer be about efficiency alone, but about empathy, respect, and accountability. Days later, the first wave of workshops began. Jonah stood at the front of the room, guiding a group of crew members through exercises designed to build awareness of unconscious bias and power dynamics. Some resisted, some engaged, but all were forced to confront uncomfortable truths. Back in her office, Celeste pored over the preliminary data from the new ethics hotline. Reports trickled in, many anonymous, telling stories of subtle discrimination, ignored complaints, and moments when small kindnesses made a world of difference. She documented everything carefully, preparing to use the findings to shape policy and hold individuals accountable. Late one evening, a call came in from a passenger who wished to remain anonymous. She spoke softly but with conviction about a recent flight where a crew member had dismissed her concerns with impatience. Celeste listened intently, assuring her that the airline was committed to change. These voices, once silenced or ignored, were now the backbone of a cultural revolution. Yet the shadow of the past lingered. Kendra and Dana's appeal processes loomed ahead. Their stories would be told, twisted, and weaponized in boardrooms and media outlets. Celeste knew the fight was far from over, but she also knew this. Change was no longer optional. It was inevitable. The skies above held more than just planes and clouds. They held the promise of justice, dignity, and respect. And that promise was hers to keep. The early morning light filtered gently through the curtains of Kendra Mays's small apartment. She sat at her kitchen table, a cup of cold coffee untouched before her. The glow of her phone screen illuminated dozens of messages, texts, emails, social media notifications all pouring in relentlessly. Her mind swirled with a mix of disbelief, anger, and a strange creeping unease. For years, she had seen herself as a protector of order in the cabin, a guardian against chaos. Now, the narrative was shifting beneath her feet, and she wasn't sure where she stood. Her fiancé, Kevin, had been quiet all morning. When he finally spoke, his words cut through the tension. "This is bigger than you thought. Kendra, it's not just about the shove. It's about the whole culture. You need to face that." She shook her head, her fingers trembling. "No, it's a setup. A billionaire playing games." Kevin's expression hardened. "No, it's your own behavior that's on trial. You can deny it all you want, but the video doesn't lie." Kendra looked away, the weight of truth pressing in. Was she the victim or the villain? Had her frustration and impatience spilled over into cruelty? Had she allowed resentment to poison her judgment? Meanwhile, across town, Dana Whitmore sat alone in her living room. The silence was heavy. The calls from former colleagues had stopped. The union had offered legal counsel, but warned her to prepare for the worst. She stared at the framed photos of her early days at Solaire Air, the uniform crisp and new, the smiles genuine. How had it come to this? Her thoughts drifted to the morning of Flight 298, the confrontation replaying in her mind like a broken record. She had sided with Kendra instinctively, protecting one of her own. But had that loyalty blinded her to injustice? Dana reached for her phone and scrolled through the statements filed against her over the years. Patterns emerged, complaints dismissed, grievances swept under the rug, moments of subtle neglect or worse. Her throat tightened. Was this the end of her career or a chance for reckoning at Solara Air headquarters? Dr. Celeste Harmon paced slowly in her office. The path ahead was fraught with challenges. The board was watching. The media was circling. And the unions were mobilizing. She opened her notebook to a fresh page titled Crisis Management. She outlined steps to manage public relations while maintaining transparency. She drafted messages emphasizing the airline's commitment to passenger dignity and safety. She planned town halls and employee forums designed to listen as much as to instruct. Yet beneath the strategic moves, a quieter, more personal battle raged within her. She thought of the countless passengers who had suffered in silence. The young mother shushed by a flight attendant. The elderly man scolded for confusion. The black woman pushed aside and shoved. How many of these moments went unnoticed, unrecorded? How many lives were marked by small indignities that, piled together, formed a mountain of pain? She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. This was bigger than one flight, one incident, one set of employees. This was a systemic failure, one that demanded systemic change. Jonah Rui sat in a training room surrounded by his peers. His voice was steady as he led a session on recognizing unconscious bias. Some of the crew shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded in agreement. Jonah shared stories, some from his own experience, others anonymous testimonies collected through the new ethics hotline. He spoke about the power of empathy, the necessity of seeing passengers as humans, not obstacles. By the end of the session, a few hands hesitated before raising to ask questions. The conversation was beginning. The culture was starting to crack open. Back at home, Kendra stared at the ceiling late into the night, the image of the shove, the backlash, the humiliation. It all swirled in a tempest of regret and defiance. She wondered if she could change, if she wanted to. Her phone buzzed again, a message from Kevin. Maybe it's time to listen. Maybe it's time to be more than the uniform. Kendra didn't reply, but she read the message twice. And something inside shifted. Across the city, Celeste opened her notebook once more and wrote, "Rebuild begins with listening." The road to justice was long, winding, and uncertain, but it had begun. The bright morning light spilled into the large conference room at Solara Air's headquarters. Staff filled the seats, a mix of anticipation and apprehension hanging in the air. Today was the first of many employee town halls designed to confront the issues laid bare by the incident on Flight 298. The weight of the moment was palpable. Dr. Celeste Harmon stood at the front, calm and poised. Her voice carried the quiet strength that had become her trademark. Thank you all for coming. We are here not to assign blame, but to acknowledge the truth, to rebuild trust, to create an environment where every passenger and every crew member is treated with dignity and respect. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Celeste continued, "Change is never easy. It requires honesty, accountability, and courage. We must look hard at our culture, our systems, and ourselves." She shared the findings from the internal investigation, the suspension of Kendra Mays and Dana Whitmore, and the launch of the Passenger Dignity Program. She invited questions and encouraged open dialogue. Some voices were tentative, others were fierce. A few challenged the changes, worried about the loss of tradition or the weight of new policies. Celeste listened. She responded with empathy and clarity. She reminded everyone that this was a journey, and their voices mattered. Meanwhile, Kendra sat in a stark meeting room, flanked by union representatives and legal counsel. The air was thick with tension. Her attorney spoke plainly. The evidence is substantial. The videos, witness statements, and the executive decision, an appeal is possible, but unlikely to succeed. Kendra clenched her fists, her mind racing. The job she had dedicated a decade to was slipping through her fingers. Her identity, wrapped up in her uniform and duties, was unraveling. Outside the meeting room, Dana waited, her face pale but resolute. The weight of years of service and recent choices pressed heavily on her. She thought about her family, her future, and the legacy she wanted to leave behind. At home, Victor Lambert scrolled through news stories and social media posts about the incident. He read the official statements from Solara Air, the growing public conversation about passenger rights, and the viral videos capturing moments from the flight. He felt a mix of pride and concern. Pride that the truth was coming to light. Concern for those still navigating the system. He reached out to Elise with a message. "If you need a witness or support, I'm here." Elise responded simply, "Thank you, Victor. Your support means more than you know." Back at headquarters, Jonah Ruiz prepared for his next training session. He reviewed feedback from the first workshops and refined his approach. His role had grown unexpectedly fast, but he welcomed the challenge. He remembered the young mother he had helped soothe during Flight 298, the elderly passenger who had thanked him quietly, the moments when kindness cut through the stress of travel. Jonah was becoming more than a flight attendant. He was a catalyst for change. As the day drew to a close, Celeste returned to her office. The windows framed a sunset painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. She sat at her desk and wrote in her notebook, "Every revolution begins with a single step. Today, we took many." Her phone buzzed. A message from Kevin. "Progress is hard, but it's worth it." She smiled and typed back, "Agreed." Her gaze drifted to the framed photograph of her mother. Alma Harmon's determined smile seemed to encourage her onward. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles, and new opportunities. But tonight, the reckoning had begun. The days following the town hall were filled with movement and momentum. Inside Solara Air's headquarters, teams across departments collaborated to implement the Passenger Dignity Program. The energy was palpable, as if a new era had begun. Dr. Celeste Harmon worked tirelessly, balancing meetings, strategy sessions, and media appearances. Yet, amidst the public spotlight, she remained grounded by the personal stories that fueled her mission. One afternoon, as she reviewed feedback from recent crew training sessions, her phone buzzed. A message from Jonah Ruiz appeared. "We had a breakthrough in today's workshop. Some of the crew who were skeptical before are now asking questions. It feels different." Celeste smiled softly and replied, "Keep leading with empathy. Change takes root when we listen." Meanwhile, Kendra Mays faced the reality of her suspension and the beginning of disciplinary hearings. The process was grueling. She listened as evidence was presented, her own defense carefully constructed, but weighed against the mountain of documentation. The legal representatives advised her to consider a plea deal, but Kendra struggled with the notion. Was admitting fault an act of surrender or the first step toward redemption? At home, she grappled with the consequences of her actions and the legacy she wanted to leave. Her fiancé Kevin stood by her side, offering support but also urging reflection. "You can either fight the current or learn to swim with it," he told her gently. Dana Whitmore's situation was equally fraught. She spent long nights reviewing her career, her choices, and the mounting evidence against her. The loneliness of the fallout was profound. Friends drifted away. The industry she loved felt distant and cold. Yet, beneath the surface, a quiet determination stirred. She reached out tentatively to Celeste's office. expressing willingness to engage in the cultural training program. At Solara Air, Jonah's role grew as he became a trusted voice bridging management and crew. His workshops sparked conversations that had long been avoided. Small shifts in attitude began to surface, signaling the beginnings of cultural transformation. Publicly, the airline's messaging emphasized accountability and renewal. Celeste appeared in interviews, speaking candidly about the incident, the lessons learned, and the vision ahead. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Celeste sat in her office reflecting on how far they had come and the distance still to travel. She wrote in her notebook, "The hardest battles are fought within. Change demands courage to face uncomfortable truths." Her phone chimed again, a message from a passenger who had experienced kindness from a crew member trained under the new program. "Thank you for caring," it read. "It made a difference." Celeste smiled. Moments like these were why she fought. The journey was far from over, but the tide had turned. The first light of dawn painted the sky over Seattle with soft hues of pink and gold. At Solara Air headquarters, a sense of quiet anticipation filled the air. After months of turmoil, transformation, and reflection, a new chapter was beginning. Dr. Celeste Harmon stood before a crowd of employees gathered in the main atrium. Her presence was calm yet commanding. The room was filled with faces, some hopeful, others skeptical, but all attentive. Today was the official launch of the Passenger Dignity Charter, a pledge that promised respect, empathy, and accountability in every interaction on every flight. Celeste's voice carried clearly. This charter is more than words on paper. It is a commitment to every passenger and crew member that their dignity matters, that no one will be ignored, dismissed, or harmed because of who they are or where they sit. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. For too long, our industry has tolerated behaviors that fall short of this ideal. Today, we choose to be different. We choose to lead with humanity. The crowd erupted in applause. Behind the scenes, Jonah Ruiz prepared for his role as the first ambassador of the new program. He would travel to hubs across the country, sharing the story of change, inspiring crews to embrace empathy as their guiding principle. Kendra Mays and Dana Whitmore had officially parted ways with Solara Air. Their departures were painful chapters but necessary steps toward healing. Both had begun personal journeys toward accountability and growth, a reflection of the complex human stories entwined in this saga. Elise Monroe, now fully recognized as Dr. Celeste Harmon, reflected on the path that had brought her here. The incident on Flight 298 had been a spark, igniting a fire that revealed systemic flaws but also possibilities for renewal. Her mother's legacy, once burdened by silence and injustice, now soared on wings of change. As the crowd dispersed, Celeste stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out at the planes taxiing toward runways. The hum of engines was no longer just background noise, but a symphony of potential. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, the same book she had carried on that fateful flight. Flipping to a familiar passage, she read quietly, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one." The words resonated deeply. She closed the book and looked toward the horizon. The journey was ongoing, but the destination was clear. A sky where dignity ruled and respect was standard. A new horizon. The story of Flight 298 is a powerful reminder that discrimination, whether subtle or overt, never fades quietly. It wounds deeply and shatters trust, yet warms. It also reveals something extraordinary, the resilience of those who refuse to be silenced and the strength of leaders who transform pain into progress. Dr. Celeste Harmon's quiet determination to expose injustice aboard her own airline is not just about one flight attendant's shove. It is a call to every industry, every community, and every individual to recognize the humanity in one another and demand dignity as a fundamental right. As this chapter closes, we honor the courage of those who stand up, even when it is hardest to do so. We reject the old systems that tolerate bias and neglect, and we look forward to a future where respect and empathy are not exceptions, but the rule. If this story moved you, inspired you, or opened your eyes, please like, share, and subscribe. Join us for more stories of justice, courage, and change. Together, we can make sure no one is ever overlooked again.